In 1933, during Franklin D. Roosevelt's first inaugural speech, Roosevelt said, "Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort." It was not until after my interview with my grandfather that I truly understood and appreciated this statement. This statement was said during a difficult time for most Americans. In history, Roosevelt was idealized as a person who could bring Americans out of a difficult and dark time. I often wonder if Americans truly understood the meaning behind his words. Can it be true that money is not what makes happiness, but in actuality that happiness is from hard work or the road through the hard stuff that builds us? Happiness was something that we strive for in my own family. Several years ago, my husband and I were just starting out with a new baby. We had ideas on what life would be like and what happiness would be. We worked hard. We both had very good jobs. Like most families in the late 2008 and early 2009, at the height of the recession, both my husband and I lost our jobs. After no savings and both our incomes being cut so drastically, the reality of our bills became overwhelming. We had moved through our lives financing our livelihood based on the income that we were making. Now, without the income, how could we possibly keep up with all of our bills? It was discouraging and disheartening, to say the least. We decided that we had to make some hard decisions. We struggled and eventually came to the conclusion that things needed to change. We needed to downsize according to the income that we were now earning. This has been a very discouraging time for us, and our entire outlook on how we want our family life to be has changed. I remember that my grandfather lived during an even more difficult time during the Great Depression. Here is a man that I have looked to for guidance my entire life, and I have completely forgotten to look for him for advice. My grandfather's name is Edward Zurbriggen. He resides in Sun City, Arizona. My grandfather was born September 23, 1927 in St. Louis, Missouri. He lived in a small town in St. Louis. His parents were not prideful and were willing to take whatever measures were necessary to feed and house their family, immediate and extended if it was required. His grandfather came from a family of 7, his sisters and 3 older brothers. Households were not known to be small during these times. In my grandfather's home, there were often other families living with them, and sometimes in very tight quarters. They lived in a small 4-bedroom home, and at some point there were 12 people occupying the home. Due to the lack of employment opportunities during this time, many people lived under one roof with immediate extended family and sometimes friends and family members. It was 1929 when the Great Depression is said to have begun. It was a dismal time for the United States and the world. It caused a financial ripple effect that would take time to repair. The New Penguin Dictionary of Modern History has stated that there was unprecedented unemployment in the worst period of the slump, 1929 to 1939. 27% of workers were without work. Starvation was the largest threat, followed by many losing jobs, homes, and possessions. My grandfather remembered when his own father brought home a small boy to sleep at their home for one night. His father was out of work and was homeless. The homeless people would sleep in these shacks by the Mississippi River made out of cardboard, and the area was called Hooverville. The man was unable to find shelter for himself and for his son, so he asked my great-grandfather if they could stay at their home just for one night. With families struggling themselves, they were still willing to help others that were in need. In 1932, Roosevelt was elected into office as the new president of the U.S. With Roosevelt came hope. Roosevelt came with a complete overhaul of the U.S. system. The Encyclopedia of North American History stated that with Roosevelt came several programs to reform the Great Depression. With this new reform, he also introduced the New Deal, which included the Social Security Act, the Public Works Administration, the Agricultural Administration, and the Work Progress Administration, which is also known as the WPA. My grandfather explained how this new legislation impacted his family. If it wasn't for the WPA, my great-grandfather wouldn't have had a job. In 1941, he was hired on at the railroad and shoveled coal. A year later, he became an engineer. My grandfather remembers him coming home in extreme pain every night from shoveling coal. The fact that my great-grandfather would work himself to the point of physical exhaustion further emphasizes the sacrifices that Americans would make during this time to ensure the well-being of their families. My grandfather needed to begin working at a young age to help his parents to build. This was a very common expectation during this time period in history. My grandfather began working at 11 years old. It was often left to children to resolve adult issues when it came to the point where bills could not be met. My grandfather told me a story about when his family owed $17 a month for their furniture bill and they couldn't make it. So at 11 years old, my grandfather went down there and talked to the man and asked him if he could pay when he could. The man was so impressed that he allowed my grandfather and his family to make payments as they could until they could pay it off. This experience in my grandfather's life made him the person that he is today. Growing up, my grandfather learned to borrow and only purchase what he had enough money to buy. My grandfather always worked hard to provide for his family. Today, my grandfather is always quick to remind me that we have a strong family today because of what we worked through. I'm reminded of the admiration and respect that I have for him. After experiencing what my husband and I have experienced and listening to my grandfather, now we see a whole new picture. Now instead of big, nice, fancy things, we see a picture of savings and security in family. This has brought my family so much closer by working through this difficult time together. We have a new respect that now we can make it through anything. So yeah, I do believe that the road through the hard stuff, that builds happiness. I agree with what Roosevelt said, that the possession of money doesn't give you happiness. Good?